Thank you, Hamid, for the introduction. And Harma, thank you for organizing this so beautifully. I look forward to meeting with the volunteers later. You put together a beautiful space. It feels great to be here. And Holland has really become quite a center for the work, meaning that we've come a long way from 15 people in a living room with Hamid to 20, then 25 and 30, then a couple of living rooms, and then bigger, and then into other states, other countries, cultures. So it's really a blessing, I feel, that I'm sitting here being able to offer you the opportunity to, first of all, check this cover out. I love it. The woman who made this, we found her in Croatia. I had an immediate connection with her, and Shambhala allowed me to choose her to do the cover of this book. And it speaks to what the book is, what the path is. It also it says a whole lot about me. It's colorful, it's dynamic, it's faceted, and it has hidden things in there. If you really look closely, there's actually a scene behind all those facets. So although it displays itself quite colorfully in the front and has a lot of energy in it, there's things you might not notice because of the intense display. And I think it's just brilliant how that came together. So I would trust you to judge this book by its cover. Normally we say, no, don't just go with the appearance, but this cover really does say it all. And as you go through the pages, it simply illuminates everything that's right out there in front of you. And that's very much what the Diamond Approach does. There's so much just right in front of you that's just beckoning you to open it up, to look at it straight on, and everything is saying, look at me, see me. There's a treasure inside of this. And the Diamond Approach really does help to open up every experience you have, honoring where you are and that it's not a mistake what's going on with you. And so we need to really learn how to be friendly to ourselves and not just take on a teaching that says there's this state and that state and, oh, I better get this one and that one pretty soon or I'll be missing out. I mean, we all have that attitude at first, right? Because we want the freedom of the feeling that comes with those kind of openings. But what we often don't recognize is that the very experience we're in at this very moment is a doorway to that opening. In fact, you have to know there's a door first. And then you can find the tools, the key that unlocks that door. And then you recognize as you unlock that door turns into a window, that it really wasn't as slammed shut. That in and of itself, what we are is not some kind of a structure with are hold barred and toughened up. That's something that occurs to us in our living and experiencing and the defenses that we have to enlist in surviving certain elements that happen to us. Everybody develops an ego. That's not a mistake. But how rigid that ego is and how held tight that is will depend a lot on what you went through. The beauty is that when we begin to want to seek a spiritual path, even before we know there is such a thing, sometimes we feel existentially in crisis, or we're having great difficulty, or somebody talks to us about some way that they actually were able to get beyond that for a moment, or you've had an insight that took you beyond it. We know there's something else, and we get drawn to a particular way, a certain kind of path. We meet somebody, or there's a resonance to a book we read. But there's, in human beings, at a certain point in our life, we start to get the feeling there's gotta be more than this. There has to be. It doesn't make sense that there isn't. Even if you're atheist or agnostic, you still have the concept of God that you're banging up against. You're either saying no, maybe, or yes. And all of that has to do with, is there more? And if there is, what is it? And then everybody argues about the very thing that is more. Once you start having experiences and they differ from one another, and what is the most ultimate, and then we can have all kinds of decisions about what really is the most topmost thing. What drew me to the Diamond Approach was absolutely nothing. I wasn't drawn to the Diamond Approach. It didn't exist when I was drawn to Hamid. In fact, I wasn't even drawn to Hamid. We got plopped into a car together, and that was it. And as I wrote this book, I began to see how the threads of our lives came together. I wasn't intending to get biographical about it, but I realized once, let's see, how did I meet him? And I started to see how these synchronicities really had an intelligence to them that brought us together and started things moving. Literally, moving. 4 wheels on the ground. And I call that the first vehicle of the Diamond Approach. Was my VW Bug. It was sky blue, and I'm having all these memories at the moment of what it was like to just sit there in that car with him for hours and hours and hours, and I never, those weren't that comfortable, those cars. You're puttering along and sputtering along, and you're feeling every knock and bump in the road, and I'm going, I've never had such a good time. And it was like a 24-hour drive. But we learned a lot about each other, and I was totally comfortable. Something really lovely opened up there, and you'll read all about it in this. I don't need to go through that story again. But every time I sat to write, I can kind of feel it now, I would feel an upwelling of gratitude. And I would feel sometimes completely incapable of getting down into writing how this magical path emerged. I did not know how I would do it. I never wrote a book like this before. I dabbled in various forms of art. I went to art school. Writing was not my forte. I attempted to write at different times in secret, and those worked out all right. But I couldn't imagine myself writing this and having it written in a way that I really wanted to draw you in. I wanted to take you in there with me. I wanted to have you as if you were by my side, moving through my inner experiences with me, so that I could show you, not tell you what it was like. I wanted to show it, and constantly my editor, when I would come up with starting to get a little pontificating about something, or a little telling the story, she said, honey, I know you can do it, feel it, show them. Show them that. Don't tell them. And every once in a while, when it was a little too vulnerable, a little too intense, a little too much secrets coming out, she said, "You're telling them again, and that's not going to do it. Telling them you feel vulnerable is not the same thing as describing exactly what this felt like." So these pages are filled with my pains, my tears, and my greatest joy. And all of that is something I want you to be able to feel, because I felt taking me and some of those teachers at the beginning, me and Faisal and Hamid, and some of the things we went through, and then some of the teachers, and trying to describe the actual, sometimes excruciatingly painful, and sometimes exquisitely transforming and transporting experiences, shows how the path works, shows how the teaching arrives, and shows the kinds of tools that show up for us to learn how to validate our own experience, not just believe what somebody's saying. In fact, that's one of the main tenets of the Diamond Approach. Do not believe me. Listen to what I'm saying. Feel what happens to you and find out for yourself. Find out for yourself, and the way you're going to feel realization, awakening, opening, reality, transformation, it will be unique to you. But there will also, in every teaching, be a universal principle at work when the Logos is really in you, and there will be universal phenomena that you'll be able to resonate with. But in the Diamond Approach, we move back through history, peeling back the layers, and those layers are part of the uniqueness that you are. And they hone you to a jewel that's very uniquely you, not like anybody else. At the same time, there are certain qualities and characteristics of our nature, of reality, that are going to be universal, that will be things that we can talk about that have a common language. You might describe them differently. But that's also something that I found was useful about this book. After I wrote it, I found out a lot about why I wrote it, actually. I thought it was to chronicle the teachings. And in fact, I didn't start out to write a book. I started out to chronicle the teachings. I thought, at some point, it will be very useful to have this. So I started writing it, and I thought, if one more person asks me how it happened, I'm just going to hand this to them. Because I had to tell the story over and over and over again in different ways with different questions. So I started writing, and then somebody said, you know, that's going to be very useful for many people. And I said, you think? She said, yeah, how many times have you had to tell all this? So I realized that there was a lot more I wanted to tell you. In fact, as I sit here, I want to tell you everything. I want to tell you everything I am, everything I learned, everything I know. But you'll just have to get that by feeling me as deeply as you can. All I can do is give you some details and encourage you to read the book if you have more questions. But one thing that's extremely satisfying is it also seemed to help people to trust their own voice when they saw what I went through in trusting myself more and more deeply. They felt reignited with the courage to just go in and find out what was there and be willing to give up what everybody else was thinking. Yes, there's a path. There are all kinds of incredible details and all kinds of wisdom. And you have to let it go at every step, truly not knowing. But I have some pieces I'd like to read. In fact, I'm wondering how many people here have had no experience at all with the diamond approach. So there's a few of you. Okay, so I'm going to try to fill out the picture a little bit and fill out the picture a little more for some of you who are here who have had experiences. And so those of you who really don't know much about this work, I encourage you to ask some questions at the end, but something might get stimulated. Hamid's books, as he said, are very dense. You could read one paragraph and spend the next year trying to understand what it means. I understand the diamond approach inside out. I know it conceptually. I know it experientially. I read a paragraph and I need to think about it. I read a paragraph and I need to think about it. The interesting thing is, I do the same thing with my book. When I read it, I went, oh, wow. Gee, oh, I see now. I had a lot of insights reading this thing. It was amazing. I thought, who wrote that? The truth is, I feel like this book kind of wrote itself. And it did, really. I feel, when someone says, your book, I feel like what I learned, another thing I learned as I wrote this, was that the same energy, the same push, the same upwelling, the same drive I felt in the teaching to take me deeper into myself was the same feeling I had every time I had to sit down and write. And sometimes it was feeling like I had to sit down and write. But it got me like a fish hook, and it just drew me to my computer. It reeled me in, sat me down, and got me going. And there were days I wrote the same thing so many times. It was frustrating sometimes, other times it just flowed out of me. But over time, my life even changed in writing this book, and in the last 2 years, every single, before it came out, of course, before I had to take the last edit, every single spare moment was spent writing. Every single one. And Hamid would say, can we have coffee? I said, yes, for a half an hour. I mean, this is a guy that we spend hours conversing, doing things, walking through life, and inquiring as we go along. And I put much of that on hold too, which was a huge sacrifice, because that's the most fun thing I do. So I'm going to read to you a little bit about something that occurred with me one night after a meeting that Hamid had. And it was very transformative to me. And it's one of those things that when I read it again after writing it, when I read this book, I realized what had happened to me. We came back from one of the meetings that I sat in on. We walked into my little house that I was sharing with my husband at the time. He wasn't home. He was a physician, and he worked very late nights and sometimes all night. And after each meeting, Hamid and I would go in and talk about what happened. And this will give you a little example also of how my book is a little easier to read if you haven't read it. I sank into the sofa, and Hamid took his seat in the overstuffed chair. He seemed to be pondering something his chest could not bear the weight of. His eyelids matched the heaviness of his chest. Sadness molded his thin face into a younger shape. I am having trouble with something, he said, watching his index finger as he swirled it around on the plush velvet upholstery. My chest filled with gentleness. What kind of trouble? I asked. I keep having these experiences, that my teacher does not understand. He continually negates me. It's not only that he doesn't seem to get it, he tells me to forget them. You mean the presence we've been talking about? Yes, I can't help it. It keeps happening to me no matter what I do. And now that it's beginning to happen to others and becoming more pronounced, I have a responsibility to stand up for the truth, not just for myself, but for them too. How can I continue to learn from a teacher who is not seeing this or supporting it? I see the dilemma. Maybe you can't, I said with a helpless shrug. That's what I think. I love him, respect him, and admire him. He has done so much for me, but I can't continue to work with him. Are you angry? I asked. His voice turned soft. No, I'm hurt. I did get mad at the last meeting, though. When he said I was going off on a tangent, getting distracted, I challenged him and it really pissed him off. But I stood my ground and didn't cave in. This sense of something that is so real and so palpable, almost physical, is incessant. He paused to reflect on his state. The presence he had discovered had become even more distilled and substantial in his experience. Now he was willing to protect it. He knew that his teacher cared for him, but he also knew that he didn't know what this experience was, or if he did not value it. I'm not mad or hurt at the moment. I'm just convinced of the truth of this and feeling determined to follow it. That is my teacher. His eyes came alive with light. Hamid would continue to grapple with his relationship with his teacher until he extracted all there was to learn from it. As for me, Hamid intuited that even though I had made forays into this invisible realm of presence, and we had discussed it, I had experienced it, that I was conflating presence with other experiences I had had or was having. It was not crisp and discriminated for me yet. Hamid fell silent for a while and then said, "Reach out your hand." I did. It was this hand. He cupped his hand and circled it in the air, as if through extracting and gathering some mysterious nectar. He literally did this. Then he leaned over, stretched out his arm toward my waiting palm, and poured the substance into it. I felt the viscous fluid pooling as it impregnated my hand with its immediacy. The sensation continued to deepen and strengthen. Its slippery aliveness beckoned every cell awake as it moved up my right arm. It made its way throughout my torso to deliver its message into my heart and then my left arm, and then I felt it pooling in my belly. My jaw fell open and took on a widening grin as the luminous elixir traveled its pathway, enlivening my whole body. My pelvic bowl brimmed with lucid density that was spilling down through my genitals and into my thighs, legs, and feet. It quickened my spirit and lit me up with its weightless fullness. At a loss for words to describe this magical medium, I let out a wow. Eventually, some words stumbled out. I mean, I'm really here. And it was so real. It was undoubtable. It erased every sense of doubt. I felt like I let go of everything in the way. It was completely certain that here-ness was just a presence of here-ness, not just, oh, yeah, I'm really here, I'm in the moment, I'm attending to what's here right now, I'm not distracted. No, this was an undistractable, indestructible presence that was so lucid and clear. It was luminous and so now. It was like beyond now. It was like the mother of now. And that is what is necessary on any journey, that there are tools to find that place where you are undoubtable. Now, many people in the teaching say, but you don't do transmission like that. Right. But the transmission that we provide through our presence in the teaching is the transmission, and we don't do it exactly that way. And in certain situations, I have done that with people, but what came out was the quality they needed. Usually, through inquiry and through that's our main tool, is a certain kind of inquiry that this book actually describes in detail. That actually allows the teaching to get ignited and come alive in you, and through its living quality starts to unravel you. That's the fishhook. When you're ignited and it's alive in you, it starts the journey opening in you, and you can't help it. You can't help it happening. There was, as I look back on it, a very particular reason Hamid did it with me that night. And what I realized some time ago was that was a kind of presence that's unusual to get at the beginning. It was pure presence without any quality to it. It wasn't exactly clarity. It wasn't exactly luminosity. It felt like it had all of the qualities in it. It was pure presence that flowed through me. And what I learned when I was reading this book, when I felt the state that was in that moment, I recognized that what he transmitted to me at that moment, and that he was not moved to do it again, was the totality of the teaching into my soul that began to open up itself. And I was a quick study. I learned a lot from Hamid over the years, and I still do. And he was teaching, and I would sit there and I would be listening. He was not a formal teacher to me, but he certainly was my teacher. And this presence itself became the teacher for me. And that, through the tools that I gained of inquiry and looking in, and its aliveness, started to unravel itself. And that momentum gained traction in me. And so, as we would have discussions, I would be feeling things opening up at the level we both were at, that I caught up to rather quickly. He still had a deal more knowledge than I did. And it took me some time to integrate all that, but that I could then begin to come from the similar state from my own experience of it. And that way it began to fill things out for the teaching. But as it got more and more mutual over time, the teaching that furthered itself beyond the boundless non-dual dimensions required that I was able to meet him in a complete way. So it was necessary. It was a spontaneous moment that he did that, but it became clear down the road why it was important. It was important for the teaching. It wasn't just important for me. The students of the teaching don't get that kind of transmission. They get other kinds. But what's important is we offer tools for you to open up to that fluid presence yourself. And that presence, at some point, I began to recognize is what I was. It wasn't just an experience. It was implicit when I felt like I am here. But there wasn't a complete recognition that I am that. Exactly. So I have another little piece I thought I'd write to fill out the picture a little bit more. There was a time I lived in Colorado that happened. I had moved to California, where my new life was going to start with my husband. I quickly found that the new life that was going to start was going to be without him. But one night I was at a meeting with, it took me through a lot of deep, again, narcissistic and existential kinds of crises in myself that was extremely painful and difficult. But that night, at this meeting, there was a woman working, a student, who was working on something very similar to what I'd been going through. And although I had had the experiences of what it was to be my authentic self, like something beyond mind, beyond ideas, to be truly myself, just as the light of being, but knowing, no, that is truly what I am. It had fleeting experiences. But a woman was working, and she got to a point where she said, I just want to be myself, even though I have no idea what that is. And as I remember that night, she also said, and I don't care what anybody else thinks. I want to be myself beyond any of that. You ever felt that way? I don't care what anybody thinks. I want to know myself. Okay, I'll listen to what you have to say, but I got to find this out for myself. That's a very good attitude. You hang on to that. You're going to need it, because that's the only way you'll find out. Even though I don't know what that is, she said earnestly, tears stopped, time halted. The sunlit softness that had come into the room, there was a kind of love that showed up because she was quite frightened. And she was in a dark state of emptiness. Then it became brighter, more like moonlight on a black lake at night. Her back straightened and her eyes widened as though she had been shaken awake. It's like night, and I see the sparkliest stars ever. The blackness deepened into the room. Do you feel drawn to one of those lights? Hamid said. Asked. One does stand out. I feel like it's mine. She paused. I feel something in my heart, glittering light. Another pause. No, it's not mine. It's me. And I'm here, she announced. Mirroring her tone, Hamid simply said, yes, there you are. And I see you. A little parenthetical comment is that that's partly what a teacher is to do, is to help you to see yourself as a start. Then you need to see yourself. I feel simple, pure, and alive. I'm happy. Her voice turned coy, but with a blush of innocence. I feel like I want to play with you. Okay, what do you want to play? He said. She giggled. It's enough that you feel playful too. Actually, I feel we are playing. We are frolicking in space. Hamid's nod was all the acknowledgement she needed. And as I was tracking her process, insights were going off like fireworks in me. I appreciated the nuanced skill that Hamid was exhibiting in his work with her. This blended with her willingness to be exquisitely vulnerable with the whole group, invited not only my silent participation, but theirs as well. By the end of this evening, I realized that the point of light was no longer showing up in my chest. A mountainous density, much like what I had seen in Hamid, had risen up my legs and filled my belly, then my entire body with its gleaming, supportive strength. Its base seemed to be far deeper and lower than my feet. My legs no longer felt like two distinct parts of the body. They were now blended into an enormous pyramidal structure of diamonds. The point of light crowned it like a lighthouse, and I became its radiance. The sense of having a real self vanished, yet it remained implicit, as the mountainous support brought the specific quality of being authenticity itself. The feeling or even the concept of self became irrelevant. Emanating light without self-reflection, I felt the stark yet grounded solitariness of just being. No mind noise, images, or ideas could influence this simple purity. The state lasted for weeks. The brilliant point is the quintessential exemplar and understanding of what realization is in the diamond approach. Seeing ourselves for what we are and having the felt, known recognition is self-realization. The point of light specifically and precisely differentiates experiences of true nature, presence, essence, space, or any of the qualities, or emptiness, from being true nature. There's no distance between self and being. I'm not merely present or experiencing presence. I am presence. So when we know we are, we don't have self-reflection that needs to say, I know that I am. It's a felt known, and we're not looking at it. In fact, when I became that point, the point of light, it stopped being a point. Hello. I keep feeling like I'm surprised that my hand's not going through the thing. And when you are that light, you no longer feel your true self. You no longer feel I'm authentic. You simply are authentic. And that the core of you is there, but it doesn't feel that way. So that's the difference between the experience of that light and really becoming it, where you're just ablaze with the light. It just gleams. It's the glow of you. It is your nature showing up, shining out in a spontaneous, beautiful, glowing statement in and of itself. And you don't need to announce yourself. You're just there. And you don't need anyone to see it, because its presence is the awareness of being itself, shining, saying, I am, without uttering a word. The need for self-reflection is gone because you are the reflection of the mirror. You are that beingness. And that is a freedom. The beauty of that kind of insight is that's not even a self-awareness or realization. that requires you to be in an expansive, non-dual condition. This happens within your individual consciousness. That is amazing, isn't it? Because you always hear, oh, to be realized, you have to be expansive, let go of all your ego boundaries, everything is gone except for that. It does stimulate that process of having to go beyond your boundaries when that happens. When you become the point, we used to call it the point of departure, because as knowing that you're being within this location begins to challenge the boundaries, because when you know you are being, you need to recognize that that nature is the nature of everything. And it starts you on that process of recognizing that. But the question that began to show up early on was, who is all this happening to? When we say, I'm experiencing this and that, or this and such, who is it? Is it the ego? And the ego then begins to recognize itself? So we were very much kind of considering many of the other teachings and what they had to say about it, and most of them that we would read about, there was ego and there was something else. And you kind of jump over this gap and you end up in the land of wondrous, fabulous blissfulness. That wasn't exactly what was happening. For us in inquiry, we begin with where we are, and there's a seamless movement that the book will describe, I won't go into it, that moves seamlessly through terrain that you then find these pooling substances, very much like an adventure. When you're going on an adventure and you're moving through the terrain and you get a flat tire and you get, all those things happen and you go through the stream and then you find out, I've arrived at something, and there's like this, oh, that's the paradise I was looking for, or this is our destination, but this is an adventure that you don't always know where you're going. But it's a seamless movement. You don't have to meditate, jump over something, and then get to where you want to go. No, this is a movement through those doors that become windows in our consciousness. The issues of our daily life that we move through and begin to feel an opening to something else. A really good therapist. Any therapists in the room? I'm sure there's a few of you here. Since half of Amsterdam is therapists, it's kind of, at least half of the Amsterdam I know is therapists. When you have a really good session and you end up feeling like there's this relief and understanding, and you're settled. And then your client and you are both feeling, this feels good. This is like an understanding I can integrate. This feels positive. For us, that's the beginning. Oh, what's that positive feeling you're having? Well, gee, I don't know. It feels good. Don't question me. It will go away. For us, it's probing with mind, with the love and passion for the truth, lets us go into any experience. And we don't stop at bliss. It's like, well, what kind of bliss is that? And what we've come to understand is articulating it actually opens it up further. It's like spiritual surgery into the core of bliss and moving through the layers of bliss and feeling them one by one and understanding how they all move together, what they mean. So the truth isn't just to be felt and bliss out on. It's to be understood and known and appreciated and comprehended. When you fall in love with somebody, it's a great metaphor. You don't want to just puddle with them all the time. You want to know what kind of cereal they like to eat. You want to know, do they like their coffee black or with cream? You want to know everything, right? After puddling for a few weeks. But there's a point at which you want to come out and go, who are you? What do you like? The same happens for that love affair inside ourselves. But we asked, who's having this love affair? What's happening? And a very important discovery occurred about who's realized, who awakens, who is that? And what brought that out is we could start to have like Hamid would have a state of experience, and we got into all these boundless kind of non-dual conditions, and I would be this boundless love, and everything was love, and I'm blissing out, understanding boundless love, and he's like feeling some other state and going into that. And it just occurred to us, wait a minute, I'm boundless love, everything's love, and you're pure awareness, and everything's awareness. How does that happen? You are the nature of everything, I'm the nature of everything. Wait a minute, what's going on? That's an interesting question, isn't it? You ever asked yourself that? Somebody can be in a non-dual condition where everything is showing up as that is a ground of being. And teachers love to fight about it all the time. What's the deepest ground? They don't call it fighting, they call it debating. But sometimes it actually sounds more like a fight to me. And what we discovered was something very interesting. One day I was doing laundry at Hamid's house, and I walked through the kitchen, and on my way back from throwing stuff in the laundry, see, all that stuff happened a lot never during meditation. Most of it was happening in our life as we were walking around thinking about something interesting and feeling into it. Meditation's important, however. Hello. It was hard for me, but I did it anyway. Very important. And you can ask me about that later. That's a whole nother story. And Hamid caught my attention and said, I'm learning more secrets about the mystery of our individual consciousness, he said. And he said it as though he were talking about the weather. It's like, oh, by the way, I just discovered a new profound truth. That's very much the way it was going. Sounds interesting. I felt a swell of fascination and redirected my plan for the afternoon. I'm all ears. What are you finding out? I knew this was going to be a longer story. He took his usual seat at the kitchen table. I woke up a few times last night and found myself having a flash of the libidinal ego. Now, for those of you who don't know that term, it's a term we had for a certain kind of experience when we were dealing with a certain layer of our ego structure. Because we peel through psychological issues and have different understandings as we go. And we kind of got to this layer that felt like this very alive, dynamic presence, but it felt much more alive and kind of primitive in nature and had a certain characteristic of presence, but at the same time it didn't. And so we called it the primitive ego or a libidinal ego. There were some ego psychologists that had that term that they used, so we kind of borrowed it and called it libidinal ego. So basically it was an experience of something we didn't quite understand all about. And that showed up as he was waking up. It seemed to be fearful, so it had feelings too. It was kind of a formless kind of thing. And I found myself having a flash. It was fearful. I could not tell of what. It felt quite fine and smooth. It moved like delicate mercury. I nodded, slid into the padded bench by the window, eager to hear more. It was really interesting, Cran. Cran is one of my nicknames, reserved for my closest friends. Don't start calling me Cran, please. There's a lot of other nicknames I also have. It was really interesting. It was like I was the blackness of the absolute perceiving this thing pass before me. So Hamid was very settled in the absolute for several years, and there were a lot of insights that arose from that place. And as I got more settled, I began to see very much from that perspective as well. He went on to say, this manifestation of the libidinal ego is quite amazing. It is the most alive and vigorous thing I've ever experienced, much more than any essential state. It feels like an alive creature, and it's changeable in terms of state. It's very dynamic regardless of whether it is positive or negative. Wow, so the libidinal ego seems to be evolving in some way, I offered. I'm not sure. I've never heard of such a phenomenon, and it is difficult to believe that it's only ego. It seems to be pure consciousness that's totally alive, but I see it only in flashes. I don't get to experience it long enough to understand it because it's always running so fast into hiding. We had borrowed the term libidinal ego from Fairbairn to describe our experience of a living formlessness that contains all kinds of raw instinctual energies. We thought of it as a manifestation of personality or ego in a primitive form. Hamid and I talked for another hour. My body was electric with excitement. Not an unusual experience for me. This was usually a sign that we were on to something. We parted company and I ascended the stairs to my treehouse, eager to see what the night would bring. Marie, Hamid, and I would be meeting later for dinner, and Star Trek reruns we'd be on after that. So we would watch our show and continue pondering our long-held query of who or what was having all this experience. This was the first use of the term soul in a succinct, defining statement about how all the parts of self, from the mundane to the sublime, function and interconnect. And there's an entry from Hamid's journal that's in the book that describes it. That is when we coined the term soul. We didn't coin that term. We used it, but we coined it in the diamond approach and gave it a very specific definition, that it is the individual consciousness, and it answered that question. Who's having all these experiences? It's the soul. And that we began to understand that the soul itself was going through a clarification process. And it was beginning to reveal its nature as the absolute. But we hadn't seen it for the very substance of what it is, because usually it has content, and we're aware of the content of our experience, not what is experiencing it. Even experiencing states of revelation, realization, those are still content. So it's easy to be addressing content and not actually get a sense of who or what is there. So I don't expect you to understand or comprehend this for those of you who don't know it, but it's to give you a feel or a flavor of that which is in you that can span and encompass any possible experience, and that it's always your experience, even the experience of boundlessness. Boundlessness is your experience of a slice of reality. Boundless love is one way you experience reality. Boundless being, another way. Absolute, yet another way. And that is your soul in contact with a certain facet of true nature and how that's manifesting within your experience right now. It's very, very personal to you. It is your personal experience of your nature. And your nature, at some point you begin to realize, is the nature of that soul. That's so cool. That there's actually a validation of, it's me, it's what I am, but who is that? And that soul is a unique current in the dynamic flow of reality. And that current can completely dissolve. But as you reemerge, and I write about that in here too. When you re-emerge, you're still that individual consciousness, but you can feel you are the expanse, peering through the individual consciousness. And that can feel like it's in front of you, because what you are is everything. But you can also realize that that's not just in front of you, it's in the midst of you, like a cloud that's surrounded by night sky. We're becoming friends, aren't we? It gives a feel for why inquiry works, why that tool has such an incredible capacity, and why it slices through and moves through those layers. Layers of what? It's the layers of your soul. And it has your nature and everything that's hiding it. So you just move through an issue, and it will arise. If you go deep enough into anything, you will dip into a wellspring of being. It can't be any other way. That's the nature of everything, including that issue you had. It's also the nature of that. It's also the nature of the person you don't like. So when we learn about our nature, and that it's the nature of everything and everyone, we recognize that everyone's nature is that ground and is good. So you can not like somebody, but you can't not like their nature if you really know what that is. Gives people a lot more room. As a result, you get more patient, a little kinder. The trick is remembering your nature when they're doing something you don't like. That takes a while. That's called development. I'm going to finish with one last entry. This is my last book talk in Holland, and I wanted to also give a nod to Jessica Britt, who brought the teaching here and who opened up to the Dutch and the Dutch to her. She's a lovely being with tremendous power of the teaching in her, and a very good friend of mine, and I'm very sorry she's not here. It feels slightly incomplete, but as I feel that, I know she's here because we have a very intertwining and loving friendship. And I'm just so pleased to be able to be sitting here among many of her students, I believe. And I'm just really appreciating her at this moment, that I can be bringing you this book and this teaching in this way. And this very few of you will understand, but it completes the picture because it has to do with Hamid's and my experience at some point of feeling that we had left the path of the diamond approach. In fact, we were fairly certain that the teaching had completed itself with the understanding of the soul and the journey of descent, which you can read about here. I'm not going to go into that. In the integration of all the dimensions and all of that into the, I'm starting to go into it, I can't say a word about it. But anyway, we felt we had completed it in the non-dual, boundless dimensions. We started to have experiences that were inexplicable. We went for years floundering. We still taught, got very clear about what we were teaching. We could take on the states of what we were teaching, but it had nothing to do with where we were at all. And we were perplexed. We were sometimes discouraged, sometimes lost, It was a very difficult time. Actually, it wasn't even difficult, it was perplexing. It was confusing. It was vague. It was unusual. We didn't know how to drive our spaceship anymore. It wasn't going into the places that brought clarity, understanding, and new experience. This was an experience that was beyond anything else. So we went through a certain period and began then to start to have some glimmer of understanding that brought in what we call the third turning of the teaching, that had to do with going beyond the dual and non-dual, which sounds really wacky. And so if your head's short-circuiting, that's perfect, because that's exactly what it did to us for a very long time. So it's not something to try to understand. You can get a little more specific in here, and you might have to wait for the sequel to my book to get the rest of that. But I didn't write a lot about it because it does not ring true to people's usual experiences. The first and second turning, which has to do with the individual consciousness and her journey inward to that point of recognition of that you are present, into the boundlessness. Many people can relate to a lot of those kinds of issues and difficulties and barriers, and many of you have had experiences of presence and different kinds of things that brought you to the work. Some of you are sitting here feeling there must be more to life, there must be more to this, and besides, my wife kind of dragged me here, so I think I'll listen, whatever the reason. So the third and fourth turning have not been written about publicly that much until recently. Hamid's got a book out that does bring some of that in. We are starting to talk about it a little more, but there are about 35 years of experience that have not been unpacked or taught in the school. So I did a quick run over it, but I'm going to say a little bit about this. The understandings that were arriving during these times and those that would span the next decades were so different from what we had known before that Hamid and I felt we had left the path of the diamond approach. As it turned out, we did leave the map, but not the path. This leg of the journey defied all categories. It was not easy for Hamid or me to discuss our new realizations with anyone. Though Hamid found slight resemblances to certain Zen teachings, we were very much on our own with these breakthroughs for the better part of 20 years. It was as if a muzzle had been implanted that would pop up into place the moment I began to say something about the crystal. Oops. The crystal, one of the ways that this showed up over time was a crystalline kind of presence that actually dropped into our experience as a meteorite. It was a really weird experience and very uncomfortable, not blissful, not anything I ever would have wished for. It didn't even feel spiritual. So that's the short version of that. I could not say more than a few words, even to the few friends who had peripheral experiences of it, before going mute. I literally couldn't say anything. I'd be at a dinner table with someone I knew, one of the senior teachers who's actually the president of Rizwan at the moment. He was really close to these realizations, and I started to, it literally would not come out my mouth, as if it was a secret that needed to explicate itself, illuminate itself, and come into knowledge, more knowledge, before I started blabbing about it. Insights slipped in quietly like invisible wanderers sitting in the corner of our consciousness, awaiting our notice. But we were still using the flying manual for an outdated starship, and it was jamming the guiding mechanism of this new vehicle. We needed a better guidance system for navigating through and beyond space-time, because these experiences were beyond time and space literally. In the non-dual condition, or the expanse of true nature, the unity of true nature. It's often talked about as beyond time and space. However, it's still an expanse. An expanse is space. So we were experiencing something that actually eradicated space. We needed a better guidance system for navigating through and beyond time and space. Gradually, it became evident that the source was conveying the wisdom of freedom from various angles that we had not thought about, experienced, or even known we wanted. One day during an exploration, we finally saw the connection between a certain kind of emptiness and this inscrutable presence. It took us to somewhere that felt like nowhere, literally nowhere. No space, no time, no nothing. This brought new and different kinds of union, as when Hamid and I felt ourselves interpenetrating with other people or things. More than once, we experienced each other as two dense fields overlapping while we remained autonomous. Sometimes it was as though a whole universe existed within both Hamid and me, and we collided without losing our individual forms. Then there were the occasions when I felt that everything was within me, or what I was in everything. And to top the mind-blowing factor another notch, I occasionally felt myself in everything and everything in me at the same time. Like Indra's net, in which each diamond at each juncture reflects all other diamonds within the net. Or in a hall of mirrors that reflect one another infinitely, there appeared no infinite extension, but in reality, that was not the case. I misread that. A hall of mirrors that reflect one another infinitely, there appeared to be infinite extension, but in reality, that was not the case. This experience, which heralded in a new vehicle, a new teaching condition for our work that shows up in the form of what we call vehicles, they're presences that brought the wisdom. It made it possible to have these types of unity experiences. We call them experiences of unilocality or unilocal unity with another person, group, or the whole universe. Unilocality is the view of reality related to a particular condition of emptiness that has no sense of space, extension, or distance. The experience of being in union in this non-dimensional nothing is unilocal unity. It can be with two or more individuals sharing the same location, often experienced as being inside one another. All forms exist within one another. This is one of its teachings. So that is just a foray into other possibilities. Oops. And they haven't ended yet. There's no end. They're simply gathering more fortification for the tools that you gain, and as it becomes more part of you, inquiry can take you into magnificent and wondrous places, or nowhere at all. And the freedom, really, is to be able to participate in life and to not have to be anyone or anything at all, but you can be anything. The freedom to be is really a liberating experience, but you don't even have to be presence itself. That realization of knowing that you are being is the beginning of the unraveling of a whole universe of experience, and the freedom is to be anything and everything or nothing at all. So thank you for allowing me to be here, and I hope you enjoy the book. It's got a lot more treasures in it, and there are hundreds of pages that did not make it into this book because it got too fat. Perhaps they'll come out one day, but I had to really take it down to its basic constituents. I hope you enjoy the journey.